On Monday, 27th October 1919, at the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh, 55-year-old William Lamb appeared before Judge Andrew Anderson, Lord Anderson, on a charge of murder. On the indictment, it stated that between 23rd and 24th July 1919, at his home at 88 Candlemaker Row in the city, he'd assaulted Agnes Mackay or Sterling, also known as White or Lamb, who lived with him at the time. She was the wife of Andrew Whiteman Sterling of 12 Loch End Close in the Canongate, but the two had separated 13 years beforehand. It was alleged Lamb had beat or kicked her on the head and body, resulting in her death, simply because she wouldn't bring him his pipe. Following the discovery of the body, a post-mortem examination was carried out by Professor Lawrence Smith and Dr. William D.D. Small. They found extensive external injuries to the woman's head and bruising on her left side. Her ribs were broken in 11 places, and her death was due to injuries inflicted on her, which resulted in hemorrhage and shock. They believed the injuries had been caused by a blunt object and couldn't have resulted from a fall, but rather from the toe or heel of a boot. Small had visited the house at Candlemaker Row at 10:45 in the morning of the 24th, and it was his opinion the woman had been dead for around 10 hours. He also believed the injuries had been inflicted while she was in bed. The Lord Advocate, James Avon Clyde, King's Counsel, MP, and John Wark led the prosecution case on behalf of the Crown, while Mr. Watt, King's Counsel, and John Gordon Jameson, MP, acted on behalf of Lamb. The house in Candlemaker Row consisted of one room that was furnished on the second floor and was accessed by a stair, on which one of the witnesses in the case, James Robertson, believed he saw bloodstains and had marked them on a plan for the court. Mary Finlay of 37 Candlemaker Row told the court she let the house out to the Lambs in May of that year. William Lamb made a living by going out with an organ, but had lost his arms, so used his feet to work the treadle. She said Lamb and Agnes seemed to get on well together, except when they'd had a drink, when they would argue. She'd found out about the murder from Mrs. Margaret Ross, a neighbour at 54 Candlemaker Row, and when they were talking, Lamb approached and told them he'd already been to the Central Police Office in the High Street to inform them of what had happened. After this, Mrs. Finlay and Mrs. Ross went to the house and saw the body. When she turned down the sheet, she saw blood and knew it was foul play. At the time, Lamb was present in the room, but it seemed to her he hadn't been drinking. Later that day, she saw Lamb again, but he claimed he could remember nothing about it, and that he'd found her like that at 5 that morning. Andrew Whiteman Sterling had married Agnes on 1st August 1900, but after 4 years of marriage, her drinking got worse, so he had to break up the house and took her to live with a married sister. She stayed there for 12 months, but decided to leave him. On Friday, 25th July, he heard of the death of Mrs. Lamb at 88 Candlemaker Row. On 26th July, he went to the city mortuary and identified his wife's body. He hadn't known Lamb and didn't know she was living with him. Mrs. Ross told the court she'd seen Agnes at a local public house on the evening of the 23rd and saw her being ejected from another pub as she was so intoxicated. At around 11 o'clock that night, she heard a woman scream, and the next morning found that Agnes White, as she knew her, was dead. In contrast to Mrs. Finlay's testimony, she believed he was worse for drink, and he was crying. Another neighbour, Mrs. Jane Brodie, thought she heard someone fall out of bed in the early hours of the 24th. She also thought she heard the sound of a body being dragged and furniture being moved. Mrs. Mary Brown, also of 88 Candlemaker Row, had seen Agnes with bruises on her arms, as Lamb could use a stump of one of his arms. On the morning of the 24th, another neighbour at the premises, Mrs. Mary Ann Kerr, was asked by Lamb to empty a bath for him. She saw the dead woman lying on the bed with her face to the wall. She also saw blood on the left side of her face. When she saw she was dead, she exclaimed, "Who in all the world has done this?" And Lamb replied, "I don't remember. I wish it was me and not Aggie." William Wilson, another pedlar and neighbour, spoke to Lamb on the morning of the 24th outside. When he asked why he looked so smart, Lamb had replied, "I think I will be going to prison." He went on to tell Wilson he'd been at the police office twice that morning, the first time at 5:30, when he'd reported the sudden death of Agnes to Detective Sergeant Francis H. Berry. He'd told the officer he'd found her an hour beforehand. He then invited him into his home. There he saw the dead woman, but initially thought she was drunk. When he realised she was deceased, he asked Lamb how it had happened, but he replied he didn't know and was as innocent as the child born. At court, Professor Lauren explained he'd been sent a pair of boots by Robert Knox of the City Police and discovered blood on them, but couldn't definitively say if it was human, but suspected so. He told the defence team that it was highly unlikely the injuries were caused by Agnes falling against an object. Knox confirmed they'd belonged to Lamb. Detective Inspector Scott then took the witness stand. He told the court he'd interviewed Lamb on the morning of the 24th in a room at the police station. Lamb wore a kilt, and he found bloodstains not only on his boots, but on other parts of his clothing. Searching him, he also found a metal hook, like one that fastened a woman's skirt, in the stocking of his left leg. He also examined the black skirt Agnes had been wearing when she died, and it was missing the hook from the band. He matched the hook with others on the skirt. That evening he charged Lamb with the assault and murder of his partner. Lamb claimed he knew nothing about it. The only witness for the defence was Lamb's 18-year-old son, William, although he had an older son and a daughter. He gave more background on Lamb, who'd been born in Glasgow around 1864, but when in his 20s had moved to Inverness, where he stayed for many years and worked as a chimney sweep. He said he'd saved a number of people from drowning in the River Ness, and he'd been awarded the Humane Society's medal for his life-saving. Following an accident which saw him lose his right arm and much of his left near Glasgow in 1908, and following the setting up of a subscription fund, he was able to afford an organ worked by a treadle to try and earn some money as a street musician. Mr. Watt, on behalf of Lamb, contested there wasn't enough evidence in the case to prove he'd murdered Agnes. However, Lord Anderson steered the jury towards finding him guilty as charged, and after an absence of 25 minutes, they returned with a guilty verdict, but recommended clemency. The judge said he would pass that on, but in the meantime he said he had no choice, so donned the black cap and passed the death sentence to be carried out by hanging on Monday 17th November. Lamb remained calm and nodded to his counsel before he was taken back to the cells. A petition to reprieve him was presented to the Secretary of State for Scotland, Robert Munro, the MP for Roxburgh and Selkirk, by Lamb's solicitor, Lindsay Crawford Steele, and after some debate, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. On 23rd April 1920, he arrived at Peterhead Prison, where he was tasked with moving tools about on his back from the blacksmith's shop at a local quarry. Lamb couldn't feed himself. He had no teeth and refused to wear false ones, and couldn't dress himself, so always required help from the prison guards. And eventually, after just over 10 years, the authorities looked at releasing him to live with his children, but they couldn't take him. His nephew Peter Keenan was also looked at, but he only had one room for himself and his family in Glasgow. In June 1931, he was finally moved to the Barnhill Poorhouse in Glasgow and into the care of the governor. However, he hated it there and escaped, making his way back to Edinburgh, pleading to be returned to jail. He was returned to the poorhouse where he died in April 1934 from bronchopneumonia. As for Agnes's husband, Andrew Whiteman Stirling, he was arrested on a charge of bigamy. It transpired he remarried on 15th May 1915 and now had 4 children by his second wife. He appeared at the Borough Court on Wednesday 29th October 1919 in front of Baillie Watson. He was later released on bail following a declaration. At Edinburgh Sheriff Court on Tuesday 18th November he pleaded guilty to bigamy, and Sheriff Principal Crowell sentenced him to 21 days imprisonment. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.